For thousands of years, the human mind was a prisoner of the capricious. In the ancient Mediterranean, the world was not a system, it was a drama. If the earth shook, it was because Poseidon was striking the ground with his trident in a fit of rage. If lightning split the sky, Zeus was hurling thunderbolts. The seasons, the harvest, disease, and death, all were dictated by the inscrutable whims of invisible deities. To understand the world meant knowing the genealogy of monsters and the jealousies of Olympians. The universe was a story told by poets like Homer and Hesiod, bound together by mythos. But in the 6th century BCE, on the sun-drenched coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, a quiet revolution began. It was not a rebellion of swords, but of perception. A handful of men began to suspect that the universe was not a plaything of the gods, but a machine governed by internal laws. They dared to suggest that the chaotic diversity of nature could be reduced to a single, underlying substance. They replaced mythos with logos, reason, argument, and account. The long sleep of humanity was ending. The age of philosophy had begun. The story begins in the bustling, wealthy port city of Miletus. Here, trade ships brought not just spices and textiles, but ideas from Egypt and Babylon. It was here that Thales, the first philosopher, gazed out at the Aegean Sea and made a claim that seems deceptively simple to the modern ear: all is water. Thales was not merely guessing, he was observing. He saw that life springs from moisture, that seeds require water to germinate, and that the very blood in our veins is fluid. He stripped away the gods and asked, what is the arche? What is the fundamental stuff from which all else emerges? By answering water, Thales was wrong in his chemistry, but he was spectacularly right in his method. He was the first to propose that the world is a unified physical system. His student Anaximander pushed the story further. He looked at Thales' water and found it lacking. How could fire be made of water? They are opposites. If the world was once all water, fire would never have been born. Anaximander proposed a terrifyingly abstract concept, the apeiron, or the boundless. He argued that the source of all things must be an undefined, infinite mass from which opposites, hot and cold, wet and dry, separate and wage war. He was the first human to conceive of the metaphysical infinite, a boundless reservoir of existence that predated the cosmos. The third of this triad, Anaximenes, tried to ground his master's abstraction. He suggested the arche was air, or mist. Through the processes of rarefaction and condensation, air could thin into fire or thicken into wind, cloud water, and finally stone. It was the first theory of change based on density, a scientific hypothesis in its infancy. As the torch of inquiry moved west to the colonies of Italy and the mainland, the narrative darkened. The question shifted from what is the world made of, to what does it mean to be? In Ephesus, a brooding aristocrat named Heraclitus mocked the Milesians. He looked at the world and saw only violence and motion. Everything flows, he famously declared. He argued that the cosmos is a living fire, kindling in measures and going out in measures. Stability is an illusion. The only constant is change itself. He offered the haunting riddle, you cannot step into the same river twice, for other waters are continually flowing on. To Heraclitus, the universe was held together by tension, a war of opposites that created a beautiful, tragic harmony. Across the sea in Elea, a very different story was being told by Parmenides. In a startling poem, he claimed to have been carried by a chariot to the gates of day and night, where a goddess revealed a shocking truth: change is impossible. Parmenides relied on cold, hard logic. He argued that if something changes, it moves from being this to being that. It involves what is not. But, he argued, what is not cannot exist. Therefore, generation, destruction, and movement are merely illusions of the senses. Reality is a single, unmoving, eternal, and perfect sphere of being. This was the first great crisis of philosophy. Heraclitus said everything changes. Parmenides said nothing changes. The history of science became an attempt to reconcile these two giants, to explain how change can occur without something coming from nothing. The reconciliation came from Democritus of Abdera, the laughing philosopher. He proposed a brilliant compromise that would wait 2,000 years to be vindicated. He suggested that the universe consists of two things: atoms, uncuttable particles, and the void, empty space. The atoms are like Parmenides' being, eternal, unchangeable, and solid. The void allows them to move. Change, Democritus argued, is simply the rearrangement of these atoms, like dancers rearranging themselves on a stage. There is no divine plan, no God directing traffic, only atoms and the void, swirling in a cosmic vortex. It was a purely mechanical universe, stripping the world of purpose but granting it intelligibility. By the mid-5th century BCE, the focus of the story shifted to Athens, the glittering jewel of Greece. Athens had defeated the Persian Empire and established a democracy. In this democratic pressure cooker, the ability to speak well, to persuade the assembly and to win lawsuits became the key to power. Into this demand stepped the sophists, travelling teachers who promised to teach arete, virtue or excellence, for a fee. The most famous, Protagoras, dropped a bombshell that shattered the search for cosmic truth. Man is the measure of all things. Truth, the sophists argued, is subjective. If the wind feels cold to you and warm to me, it is cold to you and warm to me. There is no objective reality to find. Morality is merely convention. Law is the will of the stronger. They taught the ambitious youth of Athens how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. Philosophy was no longer about the stars. It was about power. In this atmosphere of relativism and arrogance, a peculiar figure began to wander the marketplace of Athens. He was arguably the most important character in the history of Western thought, yet he wrote nothing. Socrates was physically ugly, pug-nosed, pot-bellied, with bulging eyes, resembling a satyr. But when he spoke, he cast a beautiful spell. While the sophists claimed to know everything, Socrates made a scandalous claim: I know only one thing, that I know nothing. This was not false modesty. It was a weapon. Socrates believed that the unexamined life was not worth living. He saw his fellow Athenians sleepwalking through life, chasing money, fame, and power, without knowing what these things actually were. He described himself as a gadfly sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of Athens into wakefulness. His method was simple but devastating, the Elenchus. He would approach a general and ask, "What is courage?" The general would give an example. Socrates would gently dismantle the example, finding contradictions, forcing the general to admit his ignorance. He did the same with priests regarding piety and politicians regarding justice. Socrates shifted the gaze of philosophy from the cosmos down to the human soul. He cared nothing for how the stars moved. He cared how a human being should live. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that if you truly knew what was good, you would do it. Therefore, all evil was merely ignorance. But a city at war with itself has little patience for a stinging fly. After Athens suffered a humiliating defeat to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, the democracy looked for a scapegoat. They found Socrates. At the age of 70, he was charged with 2 crimes: corrupting the youth and impiety, refusing to acknowledge the gods of the city. The trial, immortalized in Plato's Apology, was a piece of theatre. Socrates refused to beg or weep. He stood before the jury of 500 citizens and dismantled their accusations with logic. But his arrogance, or rather his unyielding adherence to the truth, enraged them. He famously suggested that instead of being punished, he should be given free meals for life in the Prytaneum for his service to the city. He was sentenced to death by a narrow margin. Even then, he could have escaped. His friends bribed the guards, but Socrates refused. He argued that he had lived by the laws of Athens his whole life. To break them now, just because they were inconvenient, would be to destroy the very idea of law. In 399 BCE, surrounded by his weeping friends, Socrates drank the cup of hemlock. He died discussing the immortality of the soul, cheerful to the end. The city of Athens had killed its conscience, but in doing so, they ensured his immortality. Among the weeping young men at his feet was a broad-shouldered aristocrat named Plato, and Plato would ensure that the conversation Socrates started would never end. When Socrates drank the hemlock, he didn't just kill a man, he traumatized a generation. For his most devoted student, Plato, this was the ultimate betrayal. Plato turned his back on the political career that was his birthright. He fled Athens, travelling to Egypt and Italy, absorbing Pythagorean mysticism and geometry. When he returned, he did something unprecedented. He purchased a grove of trees named after the hero Heraclitus and founded a school. This was the Academy. It was arguably the first university in the Western world. Above its entrance, legend says, was inscribed a warning, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Inside these walls, Plato began the immense task of vindicating Socrates and constructing a fortress of truth that no mob could destroy. Plato faced a massive intellectual problem. Heraclitus had said everything changes. Parmenides had said reality is eternal and unchanging. Plato synthesized them into a two-world theory. He argued that the world we see with our eyes, the world of decaying bodies, crumbling statues, and dying flowers, is the world of becoming. It is a realm of shadows, imperfect and fleeing. It is not the real world. The real world, accessible only to the intellect, is the world of being, the realm of the forms or ideas. In his masterpiece, The Republic, Plato illustrates this with the most famous metaphor in philosophy, the allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since childhood, facing a blank wall. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, puppeteers walk carrying objects. The prisoners see only the shadows cast on the wall. They name these shadows, believing them to be reality. "Look, a horse," one says, pointing to a dark shape. Then, one prisoner is freed. He is dragged forcibly out of the cave into the sunlight. At first he is blinded and in pain, just as the mind aches when confronted with hard truths. But slowly his eyes adjust. He sees the trees, the birds, and finally the sun itself. He realizes the horse in the cave was just a shadow of the real horse. Plato tells us we are the prisoners. The sensory world is the cave. The philosopher is the freed man who ascends to the world of forms to see the absolute truth, beauty itself, justice itself, and the ultimate form, the good, represented by the sun. This metaphysics led to a radical political conclusion. If the mass of people are merely watching shadows, they are unfit to rule. The trial of Socrates proved that democracy was mob rule by the ignorant. Plato argued that the only just society is one ruled by those who have seen the sun. There will be no end to the troubles of states, he wrote, till philosophers become kings in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers. Among the students at the academy was a bright teenager from the wild north of Macedonia, the son of a court physician. His name was Aristotle. He stayed for 20 years. He loved Plato, but he loved the truth more. If Plato was the dreamer, Aristotle was the observer. When Plato died, Aristotle eventually left Athens. He travelled to the island of Lesbos, where he spent years doing something Plato would have found trivial. He waded into lagoons, dissecting cuttlefish and categorizing sea urchins. He was the world's first true biologist. Later, he was called to Macedonia to tutor a wild young prince named Alexander, who would soon become Alexander the Great. When Alexander marched off to conquer the world, Aristotle returned to Athens to found his own school, the Lyceum. While Plato pointed up to the heavens, Aristotle pointed down to the ground. This difference defines the split in Western thought ever since. Aristotle rejected the separate world of forms. He asked a practical question. How can the form of a horse exist in a separate heaven, and yet help this specific animal standing in front of me be a horse? Instead, Aristotle argued that form dwells within matter. Matter is what something is made of. For example, the bronze of a statue. Form is the specific shape or essence that makes it what it is, the shape of the statue that resembles a figure. The real world is this world, the one we can touch and measure. To understand the world, Aristotle believed you had to ask why. He developed the doctrine of the four causes. 1. The material cause, what is it made of? 2. The formal cause, what is its shape or essence? 3. The efficient cause, what brought it into being? 4. The final cause, what is its purpose? This last one, teleology or purpose, was the heartbeat of Aristotle's universe. He believed nature does nothing in vain. The purpose of an acorn is to become an oak. The purpose of an eye is to see. Aristotle applied this logic to human life. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he asked, what is the telos of a human being? Since humans are unique in their ability to reason, the purpose of a human is to live in accordance with reason. He argued that the goal of life is eudaimonia, or flourishing. We achieve this through virtue, which Aristotle defined as the golden mean, the midpoint between two extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice, too little confidence, and rashness, too much confidence. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wastefulness. We become virtuous not by reading books but by habit. We are what we repeatedly do, he taught. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE followed closely by the death of Aristotle in 322 BCE, shattered the psychological borders of the Greek world. The intimate human-scale life of the polis, or city-state, was replaced by the vast impersonal machinery of empire. A citizen of Athens was no longer a big fish in a small pond, he was a nobody in a sprawling ocean stretching from Gibraltar to the Indus River. The old god seemed silent, and the old question, how do I build a just state, felt irrelevant when the state was ruled by distant godlike emperors. Philosophy underwent a profound mutation. It stopped asking about the stars and started asking about the heart. It became a therapy of the soul. The new goal was not truth for its own sake, but ataraxia, unshakable peace of mind. In a quiet corner of Athens, a man named Epicurus bought a house with a garden. He invited everyone to join him, women, slaves and foreigners alike. Over bread and water, they formed a community based on a radical idea. Fear is the source of all misery. Epicurus looked at humanity and saw people tormented by two great fears, the fear of the gods and the fear of death. To cure this, he revived the atomism of Democritus. He taught that the universe is purely material. The gods exist, he said, but they live in the spaces between worlds, blissfully ignoring us. They do not punish, they do not care. As for death, death is nothing to us, Epicurus wrote. When we exist, death is not, and when death exists, we are not. With fear removed, the goal of life is pleasure. But this was not the Epicureanism of gluttony. Epicurus defined pleasure negatively. It is the absence of pain and the absence of anxiety. The true Epicurean life was modest, focused on simple cheese, wine, and most importantly, friendship. While empires rose and fell outside the walls, the Epicureans tended their garden, content in their private joy. While Epicurus hid in his garden, another philosopher stood right in the centre of the bustling marketplace. Zeno of Citium, a shipwrecked merchant, began teaching on the Stoa Poikile, or the painted porch. His followers became known as the Stoics. If Epicureanism was the philosophy of retreat, Stoicism was the philosophy of endurance. The Stoics believed the universe was a living divine organism, organized by the Logos, universal reason. Everything that happens is fated and is therefore necessary and good. To fight against fate is like a dog tied to a cart. You will be dragged whether you walk or not. The secret to happiness lies in the dichotomy of control. Things we control, our opinions, our desires, our character. Things we don't control, our bodies, property, reputation, and the actions of others. Suffering comes when we try to control what is not ours. Stoicism became the dominant philosophy of the Roman Empire, producing a fascinating lineage of thinkers. Epictetus, a crippled slave who taught that the mind is a fortress. Seneca, the wealthy advisor to Nero, and Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, who wrote his meditations on the war-torn frontier, reminding himself to be good even when the world was bad. As the centuries ground on, the Roman Empire began to crack. Civil wars, plagues, and economic collapse darkened the mood of the Mediterranean. The cool rationality of the Stoics and the material comfort of the Epicureans felt insufficient. People hungered for salvation. In the 3rd century CE, a mysterious genius named Plotinus arrived in Rome. He took the works of Plato and re-engineered them into a towering mystical system known as Neoplatonism. Plotinus argued that all of reality flows from a single source, the One. The One is beyond being, beyond language and beyond thought. It is like an eternal fountain that overflows, creating the universe in cascading layers. These layers are the One, the source of all unity, the intellect, the realm of Plato's forms, the soul, the bridge between the spiritual and physical, matter, the furthest point from the light, the realm of darkness and evil. For Plotinus, the goal of human life was to ascend. Through philosophy and contemplation, the soul could climb the ladder of being and eventually achieve a mystical union, or a gnosis, with the One. Plotinus famously described this as the flight of the alone to the alone. This philosophy was the last great flower of pagan antiquity, intellectual yet deeply religious. As the Roman Empire in the West collapsed in the 5th century, the intellectual landscape shifted. Christianity had grown to become the state religion. The early church fathers absorbed much of Greek philosophy, seeing Plato as a Christian before Christ. But the tension between the old pagan schools and the new faith grew. In 415 CE, the brilliant female mathematician and Neoplatonist Hypatia was murdered by a mob in Alexandria. The official end came in 529 CE. The Christian Emperor Justinian issued a decree closing the Platonic Academy in Athens. The philosophers packed their scrolls and fled to Persia. The school that Plato had founded 900 years earlier, the hearth of Western reason, went dark. The light of antiquity did not vanish, it moved. The manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato were carried into the deserts of the Middle East. While Europe slumbered through the Dark Ages, Islamic scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo kept the flame alive. They revered the philosopher Aristotle and expanded on his logic. Centuries later, these texts flooded back into Europe, sparking the Renaissance. The questions asked by Thales, the logic of Aristotle, and the idealism of Plato were reborn. The Odyssey of Reason continues. We are still the heirs of Miletus. When we trust in physics rather than Zeus, when we debate the nature of justice, and when we wonder at the mystery of existence, we are walking on the path they cleared. The dialogue that Socrates started in the marketplace has never truly ended. It is simply our turn to speak.